It's Mr. Dykstra. In this video, we're going to be looking at the question, why do we breathe? We're looking at the circulatory and respiratory system, how they interact and how they solve that problem of why we breathe. It's kind of interesting. If I was to ask students, as I have over many years, why we eat food, they'll all say for energy. But when I ask students why we breathe, they'll say to get oxygen. Perhaps you were thinking the same thing. And then if I say, well, why do you need oxygen? The common answer is so we can breathe. And so you see there's a circular argument that there's not really an answer that's well understood, at least not by students. And this is true throughout all the grades, whether it's in elementary or high school, even in grade 12, students will commonly answer, we need oxygen to breathe, we need to breathe to get oxygen. But really, it should be the same answer as why we eat. We eat to get energy from sugars. Well, we breathe to get energy out of the sugars. So the reality is that everything comes down to energy. And energy we often see in the form of ATP. Now I want you to think back for a moment to the formula for cellular respiration, which you probably all learned in the past, right? You start with, you have glucose plus oxygen, and we're going to create carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Right? And now the energy that we create is actually in the form of ATP. ATP is the cell's energy molecule. And we can think of that in terms basically of like a wallet, cash in a wallet. The more you have in there, the more you can do. The less, when you spend it, you can do whatever you want if you have enough money, right? So if you need to transport materials in or out of the cell, you need ATP. If your cell needs to divide, you need ATP. If you need to copy your DNA, you need ATP. If you need to digest the food or make proteins or make hormones or send signals, you need ATP. ATP is like the cash flow for the cell for all the different tasks it needs to do. And so the reality is that everything regarding energy comes down to ATP. That's the secret to all of these systems. It's all about this ATP, this source of energy. So where does that energy come from? Well, I mentioned already that it's coming from sugar, from digestion. It's also coming from the oxygen that we breathe in, and the oxygen in turn comes from the lungs. And ultimately, it comes from gas exchange from the air. So the oxygen's coming in through the air from breathing, goes through your lungs, and it's brought to the cells using hemoglobin on our blood system, and then it's converted with sugar, with the glucose, into the ATP that we use for our daily tasks. So already in this unit, we've looked at digestion. We looked at the different organs that are involved in it. We looked at the different enzymes and secretions in a previous video. We also looked at what happens when it goes wrong, some of the disorders and problems that we have. We saw how metabolism controls the rate of sugar digestion, and that's based on how much energy we use. So if we have greater energy use, then our metabolism would be faster. If we have a higher metabolism, we generally have higher energy. So for example, most of my life, I was active all the time. I could hardly sit still. I still have a hard time sitting still. It's because I have high metabolism. But it means you also can eat and have to eat a lot more. It also affects by your activities. If you're someone who plays a lot of sports or someone who's out and about a lot, you're going to need more food. Metabolism is also linked to fitness. Of course, the more training you have, the more active you are. That's also connected with your metabolism. The other thing to keep in mind with the digestive system is nutrition. You need to have a balanced diet. And that comes from a number of different components. We talked about the different biomolecules or the nutrients that we had, the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, the vitamins, minerals, and even water is considered to be a nutrient. So all of those different biomolecules are needed in a well-balanced diet. So if we have all those molecules, then we'll have a balanced diet, which is part of our nutrition. And vitamins and minerals would be a big part of that as well. Now you look at the respiratory system, and if I was to ask you what the function of that is, you would say to get oxygen. So we already mentioned where that comes from. It comes from the air because we're breathing the air in. Now that actually happens in the lungs. That's happening in structures called the alveoli, and they're the ones that are responsible for gas exchange. So the gas exchange that's happening is the oxygen is coming in to the cells or into the lungs, and it's being replaced by carbon dioxide, which is leaving the waste carbon dioxide after energy has been broken down. So after we've made the ATP, we have a lot of carbon dioxide produced, and the carbon dioxide is going to go into the lungs, and it's going to have the exchange with the oxygen. Other things to keep in mind here is there's anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So aerobic means that we're actually using the oxygen to break it down using this formula: glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. There's also anaerobic, which is when you're low in oxygen levels, and in those cases, you're going to be breaking it down not to carbon dioxide and water in the presence of oxygen, but you're going to break it down to something called lactic acid. And lactic acid, that's what builds up in your muscles and causes you that pain or the cramps, the side cramps or something if you're running. It's because you're not getting enough oxygen to break down all the glucose that you need for energy fast enough. So it's not that you're not getting oxygen, it's just that you're using up faster than you're getting it. And so you're switched into anaerobic, which is where we're getting the lactic acid buildup. And that's again, of course, connected with the fitness. And both of those will determine how much oxygen your lungs are able to take in. Basically, the more fit you are, the bigger your lungs and the more oxygen you're able to take in, and the longer you can stay in aerobic respiration rather than anaerobic. So it'll affect your breathing rate. Of course, that's also affected by any disorders that you might have as well. So if you have COPD, or you might have asthma or something like that, that's going to affect how well your lungs are able to take the oxygen in and at what rate it's able to do that. So then we get to the circulatory system. You say, well, what does that have to do with it? Because the lungs are getting the oxygen, the digestive system's getting the energy, the food, the molecules to actually burn in the presence of oxygen, getting the sugars, right? So what about the circulatory system? Well, it's all about transport. So the blood is going to be transporting the sugar and it's also going to be transporting the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. So again, it's going to be involved in transport. And without the transport, we wouldn't be able to get that ATP. Now the blood, there's a number of different components that we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at the different types of blood vessels. So we're going to look at arteries and capillaries and veins and things like that, which are involved in pushing the blood around your body as a communication or transportation system. We're going to look at the different types of cells that are actually traveling along in the blood. For example, hemoglobin is found in your red blood cells, and they're the ones that are carrying the oxygen, whereas your white blood cells are involved in your immune defense. Now, your heart is a big part of that, of course, as well. It's the big pump that's making it go along. And so your heart rate is very important, and there's different technologies and things like that we can use to look at and diagnose disorders in the heart and to determine that it's working properly or not. And so the heartbeat, we're going to look at how that's controlled and regulated by different nerve nodes in your heart itself. So it's not something you have to be conscious of. You don't control your heart rate with your mind. It controls itself using a set of nerves that are inside your heart already. And then what about the lymph? That's the last term we have up on here. So the lymph is actually, it's like the blood, but it's kind of like a parallel system. It's also involved in transport. It does some of the blood cells are being transported in there, but it's also doing some of the fats and lipids. So it's basically a circulatory system that's lipid-based rather than fat-based, or rather than water-based. So anything that doesn't dissolve in water is going to be traveling through the lymph, but again, it will be involved in the transport, particularly of the nutrients. But it's often connected to the blood system because a lot of the immune cells will be going into the lymph. You might have heard of lymph nodes. They're collections of immune cells that are responsible for keeping your body healthy and trapping infectious pathogens in your lymph system. And so your white blood cells can actually move in and out between the blood and the lymph. They're able to squeeze through the gaps between the cell walls in your blood vessels and your lymph vessels and able to migrate back and forth between them. So essentially, this process is all about energy, and all three of these systems work together very much to integrate getting energy so that we can live. So you could say it's basically all about life in whatever form we find it. And that's all I have. We breathe so we can live by getting energy.